Good morning, and welcome back to America's Leaders from Coast to Coast, the 250th Anniversary Edition. I'm Stephen.
And I'm Leah.
We are stepping away from our modern congressional roll call today to catch up on our presidential series. We are jumping back into the 1850s, a decade where the United States was basically a powder keg sitting next to an open flame. We just covered Zachary Taylor, who died suddenly in office. Today, we are profiling the man who took his place, the 13th President of the United States, Millard Fillmore.
Millard Fillmore. Stephen, it is so interesting how history treats certain presidents. If you ask the average American to name a president, Fillmore is almost never on the list. He is completely forgotten. But the decisions he made in the Oval Office directly paved the way for the Civil War. He is arguably one of the most consequential and heavily criticized presidents of the 19th century. But before we get to the politics, we have to talk about his childhood, because it is straight out of a Charles Dickens novel.
It really is. We always hear the myth of the log cabin president, but Millard Fillmore actually lived it. He was born in 1800 in the Finger Lakes region of upstate New York. His family was desperately freezing in the winter poor. When he was just 15 years old, his father apprenticed him to a cloth maker. And this wasn't a nice internship. It was brutal, physical labor that bordered on indentured servitude. Fillmore basically had to buy his own freedom. He saved up $30, paid off his master, and walked 100 miles through the wilderness to get back to his family.
And he was absolutely obsessed with educating himself. He would steal books just to read them. He finally got to attend a one-room schoolhouse for 6 months when he was 18, and the teacher there, Abigail Powers, recognized how brilliant he was. She tutored him, she guided him, and eventually she married him. She was the driving force behind his rise. With her help, he became a lawyer, moved to Buffalo, and became incredibly wealthy and successful. It really is an incredible pull-yourself-up-by-your-bootstraps story.
It is. But that inspiring origin story collided with a terrible political reality. Fillmore got into politics, joined the Whig Party, and was chosen as Zachary Taylor's vice president in 1848. Now, Taylor and Fillmore did not get along. They didn't even agree on policy. The country was tearing itself apart over whether to allow slavery in the new territories we won from Mexico. Taylor, ironically a slave owner himself, didn't want to compromise. He wanted California admitted as a free state immediately. But then, on July 9, 1850, Taylor dies from a stomach illness.
And Fillmore is suddenly the president. And he completely reverses course. The very first thing he does is fire Zachary Taylor's entire cabinet. He brings in Daniel Webster as Secretary of State, and he allies himself with Henry Clay and Stephen Douglas in the Senate. They had drafted this massive piece of legislation called the Compromise of 1850. The goal was to give both the North and the South something they wanted, to stop the South from seceding from the Union.
Let's break down that compromise, because this is Fillmore's entire legacy. It was broken into 5 separate bills. California comes in as a free state. They settle the Texas border dispute. They create the territories of New Mexico and Utah, and say the people there can vote on slavery later. They ban the open slave trade in Washington, D.C. All of that sounds like a reasonable middle ground political compromise, right?
Right, until you get to the 5th bill, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This is widely considered one of the most evil draconian pieces of legislation ever passed by the United States Congress. And Millard Fillmore signed it into law. The South demanded this bill to stop enslaved people from escaping via the Underground Railroad. But the law went so far beyond that. It basically turned the entire federal government and every citizen in the North into slave catchers.
The details of this law are chilling. If a Southern plantation owner claimed that a black person in Boston or New York was a runaway slave, that person was denied a jury trial. They were not allowed to testify in their own defense. A federal commissioner would decide their fate, and the commissioner was literally paid $10 if they sent the person back to slavery, and only $5 if they set them free. It was a legalized kidnapping ring. Free black men and women who had lived in the North for decades were suddenly being snatched off the streets and sold down the river.
And it got worse. The law made it a federal crime for any citizen to help a runaway, punishable by 6 months in prison and a massive $1,000 fine, even if you were morally opposed to slavery. If a federal marshal deputized you on the street, you were legally required to help them tackle and arrest a fleeing human being. Fillmore said he hated slavery, but he signed this law because he thought it would save the country from a civil war. He said it was his constitutional duty.
But it completely backfired. Instead of bringing peace, the Fugitive Slave Act radicalized the North. People who had previously ignored slavery suddenly had the brutality of the institution forced right into their own neighborhoods. It directly inspired Harriet Beecher Stowe to write Uncle Tom's Cabin, which changed the culture of the country forever. The Northern Whigs were so disgusted with Fillmore for signing the bill that they completely abandoned him. When the 1852 election came around, his own party refused to nominate him for a second term. They dumped him for General Winfield Scott.
And that destroyed the Whig Party completely. The party shattered into pieces over the slavery issue, paving the way for the creation of the modern Republican Party. But Fillmore wasn't done yet. And this is where his legacy gets even darker. 4 years later, in 1856, he decides he wants to be president again. But he doesn't join the Republicans. He accepts the nomination of the American Party, which is better known by its nickname, the Know-Nothings.
The Know-Nothings were a secretive, highly extreme political movement based entirely on anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic nativism. Millions of Irish Catholics were fleeing the potato famine and coming to America, and the Know-Nothings spread conspiracy theories that these immigrants were loyal to the Pope and were going to destroy the country. Millard Fillmore, a former president of the United States, stood at the top of that ticket. He got crushed in the election, carrying only the state of Maryland, but it cemented his reputation as a politician who consistently allied himself with the darkest impulses of the country.
It wasn't all just domestic disaster, though. We do have to give him credit for one massive foreign policy achievement. In 1853, President Fillmore sent Commodore Matthew Perry and a fleet of heavily armed U.S. Navy warships to Tokyo Bay. Japan had been isolated from the rest of the world for centuries. Fillmore basically forced the Japanese shogunate to open their ports to American trade. It ended Japanese isolationism and completely shifted the balance of power in the Pacific Ocean.
He is a president defined by compromise, at a time when compromise meant selling out human rights.
The man who signed the Fugitive Slave Act.
That is President Millard Fillmore. That is our profile for the 13th president. Stay tuned as we move into the late 1850s. Please note AI assists in the creation of this podcast from pointedwords.com, and remember, better pointed words than pointed swords.